All right. Good morning and welcome back. We are now officially in the final week of the quarter. So hooray, we're really close to the finish line. And then we don't have any meeting for the exam time. So these 3 classes will be our last meetings as we get into our final topic for the quarter. I think an interesting note to end on, which is what are the limits of listening? Right? We've talked a lot about listening, the good it can do, the way that listening can improve our own lives. Right? But listening is not a cure or easy solution to all of our social problems. So sort of understanding what listening can and can't do will be a really helpful thing to guide us at this point in the quarter. So for today's class, I want us to kind of bookend a little bit and help you to prepare for your final assignment in the course, the listening debrief activity. And what I want you to do is to take some time, similar to what we did early in the quarter, about an interesting story that happened in your life. So you might think about one that's a little bit different than what you chose early in the quarter. Some of the things that you might think about as possibilities or options to brainstorm for this story might be an unforgettable travel experience, a vacation, a travel, a competition that you went to that was especially interesting or notable. A near-death experience or major kind of injury or challenge that you dealt with. A time that you felt especially close to friends and family. Maybe you had a really exciting or interesting bonding moment. An experience that changed your perspective on life. Something really interesting that happened, or a story that you share or disclose that helps other people get to know you a little bit better. So you're not limited to those options, but I wanted to choose them as some possible prompts for a story. So what I'll do is I'll give you some time to work on, to type out, or to start thinking about this story. Again, it doesn't need to be the most amazing story in the world, but one that you would have about 5 to 10 minutes to share in a little bit.
Yesterday.
I can send it out. Yeah. take about 2 more minutes or so on this. Looks like most folks are about wrapped up. I will give you a little bit of time to return to this in just a second. So hang on to the things that you have for your story. I will ask that you share in just a little bit, but this is an opportunity to think a little bit more about listening and to share a little bit more about your experience with somebody else. So just to give you a quick look at the remaining courses or the remaining times of the week class. We'll be meeting today, Wednesday, and Friday. Those are our last 3 class meetings on the topic of the limits of listening. We'll also use Friday to kind of wrap up some things to know about the course. And then I'm going to go ahead and basically take all of the remaining assignments and extend them out to that hard deadline for you. So what that means is that the remaining last 2 weeks of quizzes, which are up on Canvas, along with the listening debrief that we'll talk about in a little bit, and the extra credit, which is also posted to Canvas. The hard deadline for turning those 3 assignments in would be on the 19th. In other words, the get out of jail free card couldn't be used past the 19th. So you can turn it in by the 19th for these assignments with no penalty. Just get that in by that date, since I'll need to turn in the final grades by. I know that we've had some delays. We started the quarter a little bit later, and so I just wanted to give you that window of time to conclude the remaining assignments and so on. The essay number 2 was due last yesterday. So if you haven't already turned that in, please do so. Or if you have used the card for that second essay, then you can turn it in by Sunday. So just giving you a sense of the remaining classes and things that you will need to make sure to wrap up and have turned in. And again, we don't have a formal class meeting on the final exam. So I want to do a quick recap of last class. Last class got into the Goggins reading. Remember that last week we were talking about what makes listening accessible to folks on disability issues. So we were situating that in terms of social and cultural and political discussion. And the challenges of listening and disability. We, on Friday's class, just used that as an optional workshop day. So most of this stuff is things that we went over on Wednesday. We talked about the idea, right, that in terms of democracy, democratic participation, and leadership, right, that we have to include and situate the perspectives of people who might not be able to access or participate in listening in the same way. For instance, we talked about #CryptTheVote, a Twitter campaign that was used to highlight the inaccessibility of things like voting machines in the United States and some of the ways in which participation, being able to create listenable messages and to be heard, need to be thought of in an accessible way. We also talked about how the practice of listening is a way to engage with stories that might not be talked about or might be ignored, right? The ways in which if we stereotype or characterize on the basis of disability, we don't necessarily create that kind of open environment. For instance, I showed a clip last week from the Netflix documentary Trick Camp, right? Where there is somebody with cerebral palsy who's communicating. To most people, you would not be able to understand or make sense of her message. However, another person with cerebral palsy is able to essentially translate and share what she's saying to people who might not otherwise understand. It's actually a fairly common practice in a lot of disability communities where people will sort of translate or share stories and experiences that might not seem like listenable messages to others. And then we indicated last week that some of the ways that we define what it means to listen, for instance, the use of eye contact, are not necessarily things that translate in the same way across disability, across culture, and so on. That what counts for listening, we can't think about as simply as, oh, you're listening or oh, you're not listening, right? For instance, with folks with ADD or ADHD, having something like fidget spinner or a thing to do, or having some level of action in the background that helps them to focus can actually improve listening. So there's a lot of considerations here about accessible listening. So for this class, in just a little bit, I'll ask you to share the story that you worked on with somebody else in the class. And then we'll talk a little bit about this final listening debrief assignment. And we'll also start to explore this final Lloyd article that gets into the limits that we have for listening. And we'll pick back up on Lloyd on Wednesday. So what I want you to do is you should have received an email on the 27th to your EOU account that included a link to access course evaluations, which you can do either on your phone, laptop, or tablet, and you should be able to access the link to do so. What I would like you to do is, if you haven't already done so, I'd like you to access those course evaluations and complete them for this course. Could also take the time to do that for your other courses too, if you've already finished this one. And then once you've finished, what I want you to do is just take a moment to look back through the story, knowing that you're going to share that with somebody else in the class in just a little bit. If there's any additions, finishing touches, or edits that you want to make, you can do that with the remaining time that you have. So complete the course evaluations first, if you haven't already, and then take some time to look back through your story. It's about 11:16, so I will step out for a minute, since I know it'd be a little weird for you to be working on that while I'm right here. I'll come back at about 11:26 or so, and then we'll pick back up, give you the chance to share the stories in just a little bit.
drivers.
Is anybody still working on the course evaluation? All right. So what I want to have us do now then is to have you find somebody in the class, preferably somebody that you did not share the story with earlier in the quarter, to just take some time to exchange and share the story that you wrote about at the beginning of class. Be somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes. If you're listening, right, to that person tell the story, what I want you to do is to think about the listening skills that you've learned over the course of the quarter, and really try to focus on applying those and using those. So listen actively, really focus on understanding what's going on. And then once one of you has finished sharing, go ahead and switch, and then you'll have the other person share their story too. For folks that are on Zoom, I will create 2 breakout rooms to give each of you a partner to talk about and share your story with. And for folks face-to-face, I'll give you some time to share your stories. So go ahead and do that for a little bit, and then we'll come back together and keep going through this. Even number, so it's yeah.
I would say about 5 to 6 months. 11 or 12.
Yeah.
I felt like that.
Most places are good. Right.
Like our old friends, thought we were all what happened. This is like this loud.
Yes, this thing you should go to hospital.
Break up. I wasn't good at it. Yeah, I don't know. I think it was like a
The cops. The cops. It was like, they're gonna believe oh yeah, his parents. It was like, I only had like I had a
So actually, because some of my guys like, I was like, I cannot go anywhere. I didn't run away. I worked on that for years. I was like, yeah, I was there for 3 months. I did everything from to like working burgers to gift shops, to
that day on, like after.
so I did a lot of things, but there was like,
Is there good?
but there's only like 2 little girls, and so really brought me closer.
I never.
And so there were lights in the front, like,
I see
and telescopes and like all like the lights and all that stuff were so cool. And so like go to the parking lot and it's like all the telescopes, like 60 curious about just massive telescope. And it was such a crowd. And it was really cool. And the day, like the night that we were like invited, like prevalent, we went up to the fire lookout, which is about like 2 miles south. And so 3 of us went up to the fire lookout. And we just lay down on the rock, and just like saw like the northern lights. So it's definitely just like this really cool like together. Yeah, it was really cool. And that like really nice because like okay, yeah, this is like what I wanted to do. And so like yeah, versus definitely what
Yeah, there's a certain
so that was just a really cool experience. We slept in the fire like it's a perfect living there. We get the keys to it. So we just were like laying on the rock, slept in the fire, little lights.
So.
Yeah, it was really cool, and it wasn't like, it was I was like, you see, like, and so like, people like drop their ears down, and like, we show like, this for like the next like 2 days, just like, and it was so much brighter than the rest, and yeah.
I don't know.
Few more minutes.
It was just like a brighter, more greenish sort of version of the Milky Way.
Nice.
Right, it was so cool, it's like the parking lot, it was like a
I brought
giant
some,
it was so much fun, it was like, they told me it was Pluto, I'm like, yeah,
I don't think I'd be there.
Saturn, like, what's Saturn, I'm like, yeah. So that was just a really
After
cool experience,
a
to
while,
see the northern lights, and it was like just us, like, just the 3 girls on the rocks hanging out. It was
When I look outside, I look at.
Yeah.
No, I only worked there that summer, and then I've been doing wildfires. But I actually, I don't know if I got it yet. I applied to work at an active fire. My sisters in Washington. So hopefully I'm just gonna live on one for like 4 months. What's up? Yeah, yeah.
So it's kind of like
You got the.
Yeah.
you got the-
Yeah, so it's like,
then they have these maps.
do you have a little bit of drawing? It's just like the random little house. Little nowhere.
And you know what question I have is I have they come
No, I'm just.
I want to get
So I don't know if I have the job like experience like that. But so there is a full-time and part-time. So it's like a almost like a garage. I think it's like Monday. Yeah, and then like Thursday, Friday, Sunday position. I apply for both. I only get one. But
I'm like,
restock on the job.
like, it's
So
like-
they allow kind of stock. I'm running hard, so like 7 years.
Yeah.
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 It was just such, it was like, but like, still like, yeah.
They just kind of stood around by having just like flowers.
Okay, yeah.
But like,
So
yeah.
take another minute or two to
Like my
back
high
up.
school.
I ended up saying that. I didn't want to
Yeah,
drive.
It's a lot less.
It was
It's a lot less.
It's like, yeah.
It's actually really
This is like. So I'm like, what a perfect like, yeah. So I'm like, and then my family. It's like, I'm like, I can't really, like, I can't get my.
Yeah.
It's a pretty hard case. And then he's doing the cheapest one. It's okay, let's go.
Right.
All right. It sounds like most groups are about finished up.
Yeah.
All right. So I feel like if we did a video comparison, this is significantly livelier than the beginning of the quarter, which is awesome. It's really interesting and fun to hear a little bit about some of the things you were talking about. Hopefully you have some good observations and notes to hang on to or to continue to think about the person that you just heard. Because I am going to ask you to use that conversation that you listened to for the final assignment in the class. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this listening debrief. I posted it at least late last week, but want to give you a little bit more so you know what to expect. So the hard deadline for that is on the 19th. I want you to use the conversation that you listened to, the stories that you heard somebody else share for this assignment. Yeah.
So I was looking at the essay yesterday. It said that we were going to use the conversation that we had earlier in the class.
So you're contrasting this conversation with the one that you had earlier.
Okay,
right?
perfect. So we can include elements of the other conversation as well and compare.
You can talk about it. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, your focus would be using sort of this conversation that you just had in comparison to that earlier conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, what I want you to focus on and think about is how your listening might have changed, some of the ways in which you feel like you've grown as a listener, but also things that you need to continue to work on. And similarly to other assignments in the class, I'm happy to look at outlines, drafts, or anything else that you'd like to send me in advance. So to get to that question and to talk a little bit more here about what I'm expecting, you'll notice the debrief activity is listed here at the bottom. You can also click here to access the prompt. So over the quarter, right, we've been talking about the challenges and the issues related to listening, what it means to be a good listener, and also kind of situating listening in context, thinking about listening as it relates to things like race, disability, gender, culture, social political issues, and so on. I have given you this opportunity in class to share stories and listen to each other. Those of you, if you're somebody who's watching the recording later, who is not here for today, I'll ask you to have a conversation with somebody else outside of class. what I want you to do is your response is 2 pages, double space, standard font margins. I want you to again summarize this more recent conversation that you've had. What did the other person share and what stood out to you from what you just listened to? Compared to the listening assessment early in the quarter, right? So getting to Zach's question, what has changed with your own listening? What about your listening is similar? What do you find that you're doing a little bit differently? And then lastly, I just want to give you a chance for some reflection here. I want you to think about 3 major things that you've learned about listening over the course of this class, what you understand about listening now, and how might you use these skills. For instance, maybe you now understand some of the different styles, like active, empathic, and so on. Maybe you've gained insights into how to use listening and thinking about accessibility or thinking about cultural difference, and so on. So I'll give you a lot of leeway on which direction to go there. I have the rubric on the next page. So summarize the conversation, right, that you had just now or one outside of class. Comparing your listening that you did here to the listening assessment that you did early in the quarter, how your listening might have changed, how your listening skills can be used. And again, especially for that last prompt here, asking you to apply and use concepts in the course. 2 pages, good kind of structure. Again, use works cited list and in-text citations when you're citing material from articles or textbook. And this is just out of 100 points. So again, pretty straightforward and kind of a parallel of the assignment that you worked on earlier. Shouldn't be a super long and intense writing assignment like 2 essays, and hopefully fairly low stress as you're wrapping up all of your classes. Any questions about this assignment? Again, I enjoyed hearing some of the conversations that were going on, and I hope that you have some good insights as you're working through and thinking about your own listening. So what I want to do now is shift gears and talk a little bit about this week's article. We'll be getting into some of the more nitty-gritty with that and exploring this article a little bit more as we go into Wednesday's class. But to give you a little bit of a preview, this week's article called The Listening Cure comes from Dr. Justine Rachel Lloyd, who is a professor of sociology at Macquarie University and is really concerned with how we use listening and relate listening to society, social political issues, and so on, right? So a lot of her work is looking at kind of situating listening and some of the limits that we might find. So the central thesis and point that I think we can take away from this article as you're working on it for this week's quiz, right, is the idea that yes, in response to the concerns that we've raised about listening not being cared about, not being seen as important in like management and corporate contexts or in personal, interpersonal communication or mediated communication, we have seen a shift in recent years toward valuing communication and listening more highly. Listening is sort of used to some extent as a buzzword, right? Practicing good listening in the workplace, you know, and things like that. But the problem, right, and sort of the title that she puts out is the positioning of listening as a cure, right? Listening is great, listening can do a lot of things, but listening can't necessarily solve every single social, political issue or difference that we deal with, right? As Lloyd argues then, listening and positioning listening sort of on a pedestal can risk placing these kind of personal acts or individual acts of care over the structural or institutional changes that might be necessary to engage with and think about it. So let me give you an example, right? If we think back to last week and the focus on accessibility, if we have folks with disabilities who sort of present themselves at a city hall or a program, city planning meeting and say, hey, public transit that's here in our city is not accessible. We can't get on the buses, we can't access paratransit, we can't get to where we need to go, right? And the response is, well, we hear you, we're listening, right? We're responding to that. And then no action happens. What has that listening done, right? That listening has to be paired with and coupled with action to resolve or to deal with the issue. Another consideration, one thing that we've talked about, especially when we've looked at stuff like empathetic listening, is the idea that listening is a very challenging and pretty taxing act, right? That we take a lot out of ourselves to really try to listen and understand a message, because we have to reel ourselves back in, we have to make that message meaningful to us, we have to recall and remember that message for later, and so on, right? So listening alone is not going to be the thing that solves an array of challenges and issues that we deal with, right? So one of the things that Lloyd positions fairly early on in this essay is the idea of the ear witness. If you think about what an eyewitness is, right? If like a murder or something has taken place, somebody saw the murder happen, they're an eyewitness. But an ear witness is the idea that somebody is listening, is paying attention to, and understanding things that have been going on throughout society and our history. The idea here is that we position listening in such a way that we assume that we have heard and listened to the entirety of our history. In this way, listening becomes this kind of cultural memory, right? The culture is the history, context, the story that we tell ourselves about our world, right? That listening has brought us there. We also, at times, think of this ear witness as accurate, as able to report on and share. Here's what happened. Here's the story of it all, right? If you read like young adult books, such as The Giver, right? That's an example of a story in which a character has this kind of very prolonged oral history, right? The idea of positioning listening as telling us everything is one thing that we see. And as a result, right, of having this approach to listening, where we see listening as something that has impacted our society and created this sense of history, it shifts from why weren't we told, right? What stories were missing, what stories aren't there, to why didn't we listen? In other words, if listening is always there, or we always have the capacity or opportunity to listen, we're therefore responsible for situations in which listening didn't happen, or messages were missed, or there were gaps there, right? So that's one concern with the way that we think about listening, is that not necessarily everybody has the opportunity to understand and fully make sense of this. So I'm going to kind of stop us there. There's a lot more that we'll be able to pick up on for later regarding the article and some of the steps in the listening process. So we'll pick up on some of those things as we get into next Wednesday's class meeting. But just to do a quick recap and give you a sense of what to expect next. Prepare for that listening debrief. The idea that debrief connects to your early listening assessment. Listening, as we started to talk about, has some definite benefits. It lets us engage with a lot of social and cultural issues to better understand each other. But we'll be exploring some of those limits and the way that we compare good listening with an ability to change and deal with social and cultural issues a little bit more. So next class, we'll continue to explore some of those possibilities and limitations. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and pass forward or email me the story that you were writing and working on for today. I'll use that for attendance. Otherwise, have a great afternoon and rest of your day. And I'll see you again for Wednesday's class.